This program is brought to you by Emory University.
It's my honor to welcome our first speaker, and in a sense the motivation for the conference itself, Peter Trawny. Peter Trawny is the director of the Martin Heidegger Institute in Wuppertal, Germany, and he specializes in political philosophy. He's the editor for all of Heidegger's Black Notebooks, which are notebooks that run from the 30s through the 70s, only the first volumes of which have been published recently in this last March that he edited. He's the author of the first book on these notebooks, Heidegger and the Myth of a Jewish World Conspiracy, English translation, forthcoming. His work on the notebooks has been the subject of articles, interviews, television pieces across Europe and the U.S. Professor Trawny is the author of numerous books in the history of political philosophy, including Socrates, or the Birth of Political Philosophy, Conceivable Holocaust, The Political Ethics of Hannah Arendt, The Authority of the Witness, Ernst Jünger's political work, Aduton, Heidegger's Esoteric Philosophy, and a book coming out next year with Polity in English, Freedom and Failure, Heidegger's Anarchy. He's currently working on what he told me yesterday was his magnum opus, Technology, Capital, Media, Freedom and the Universal. It's an honor to have Peter with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Trawny.
So, well, of course, it's an honor for me to be here in this amphitheater of Emory University, and to join this, I guess, very important first scientific conference on this topic beyond the polemics behind the facade of Heidegger research. And well, like I said, thank you very much, Andrew, for this invitation, for this important possibility to discuss these problems in the Black Notebooks, or to discuss the Black Notebooks. And because I think that my paper is a little bit long, I start immediately. So, Heidegger, World-Judaism and Modernity. In March 2014, Heidegger's Überlegungen 2 to 15 are a series of what he calls his Black Notebooks. What he himself called his Black Notebooks was published. These texts differ from Heidegger's previously known writings in what they seem to speak more clearly and directly to the philosophical motivations and intentions in his thinking of the 1930s, and they demonstrate that his being historical thinking during the Second World War was open to anti-Semitic ideas. The discussions which have until now been behind the scenes in Heidegger research have so far brought no agreement. The often unnecessary struggle for the prerogative of interpretation has finally highlighted a question again. Heidegger's Black Notebooks force us, like perhaps no other manuscript from this philosopher, to ask, how do we read Heidegger? This question especially crystallizes the issue of how we are to understand the problematic statements about Judaism. Is Heidegger's thought anti-Semitic? If so, is it something in his entire thought, or just a phase? If not, how are we to understand these statements? There is no doubt that these issues are crucial for the future of Heidegger's thought. The severity of the discussion is to be understood accordingly. There are answers that I do not want to ignore because they belong in a specific way to the problem. Thus, there have been voices raised particularly against my thesis that there is in Heidegger a being historical anti-Semitism, a thesis I will explain in more detail later. Voices which do not abstain from personal attacks. How does this belong to the problem? Am I a renegade What does it mean for Heidegger's thinking to allow the speech of renegades? Nevertheless, the opinion that an anti-Semitism in Heidegger's thinking is impossible, that a transformation of anti-Semitic stereotypes into philosophy is unthinkable, must be disputed. But a direct confrontation with the apologist has to be avoided because it necessarily touches his self-identification, his personal emotions, all this seen as an implication of Heideggerian hermeneutics. The dispute around the interpretation of Heidegger's statements concerning Judaism leads instead finally again to the question, how do we read Heidegger? I just want to say something to this question and then come to the actual problem. The first impression of this question is ambiguous. The question seems to be necessary since Heidegger's texts are often abstruse, not simply because they operate with many neologisms, but because they have their own writing style. But at the same time, it's obvious that every philosopher speaks in his own way, in his own style, with his own concepts. In this sense, we could direct the question how to read X to any philosopher. But Heidegger and his texts are a special case. Heidegger is a thinker who tried to influence the organization of his texts. With this organization originates, whether consciously or unconsciously, an authority over the text's reception. For that reason, I see at least some evidence that Heidegger differentiates between an exoteric and an esoteric sphere of his thinking or writing. The distinction of an exoteric form and esoteric sphere in Heidegger's thought corresponds to the differentiation of addressees. On the one hand, there are the lectures and published texts such as Being and Time, which do not turn to any specific addressee. In any case, Heidegger does not problematize the addressing of these texts. This changes in writings such as Contributions to Philosophy. This text speaks directly to specific addressees. Heidegger calls them the future ones or the few. These readers are now brought in a decisive manner to a position against the exoteric sphere of philosophy generally. Authentic philosophy in the public sphere, and Heidegger is thinking of the university and the media, has become impossible. It is a matter, then, of practicing this essential thinking beyond the public sphere. The thought is certainly arguable. Today we know of good public relations philosophers who function as life coaches and therefore are compelled to figure out banalities. It is more inevitable than ever to pose the question within the university. But what arose with Heidegger's uniform rejection of the public sphere and the direct address of the addressee is a group of readers who turned away distrustfully from any open discussion. It is about the emergence of the Heideggerian. The most esoteric texts in Heidegger's collected works are his black notebooks. They are not focused directly on the few as addressees. In Heidegger's thought, they speak purely and primarily to themselves, although this verdict must be refined because there is evidence which contradicts it. Through this self-addressing, thinking falls back on itself. The abandonment of the public sphere is carried out with no regard for others whatsoever. The thinking in the black notebooks speaks in a being historical intimacy to itself. In this way, the texts are, by the way, never personal or private. The esoteric initiative in Heidegger's thinking and writing in the black notebooks would not be adequately understood if we overlooked how the direct address of the addressee occurs in the text. Heidegger is not the thinker to maintain an argumentative discourse. This is the language of the public sphere. Admittedly, it would be wrong not to label a work like Being and Time as argumentative, but the esoteric address follows another, a seductive, not to say erotic style. The conversation that Heidegger's thinking looks for is not a critically distanced discussion. It is much more to do with hearing, hearkening to silence, and obedience, as he often stresses. The critical distance of an argument is opposed to the nearness of an intimate agreement. With this, the esoteric initiative first receives its authentic character. Here now is the reason why the Heideggerian assumes that Heidegger's self-interpretation must be the beginning of every engagement with this thinker. We must follow the master's instructions. The self-identification is inevitable. Now it becomes impossible for the Heideggerian that the lover, the friend, the father, the grandfather, etc., could be anti-Semitic. Even if during the 30s and the 40s not only the majority of Germans, but even the majority of Europeans were anti-Semites, it simply cannot be the case for them that this philosopher who seduces the reader with such an intimate rapport could keep to anti-Semitic stereotypes. Heidegger's thought engenders lovers. They are often, without a doubt, the best Heidegger scholars. They follow this thinking through the subtlest variation. They know it exactly and in detail. They dedicate themselves to him. Is love not the prerequisite for any hermeneutics? An interpretation born from hatred is bad mostly because the one who hates has no patience to engage with the long-windedness of the philosopher. This is also the same for Heidegger research. But then the question of how we should read Heidegger seems operatic. Either we become Heideggerians who penetrate the vast corpus of Heidegger's thought, or we become mediocre researchers and or critics who only look at this philosophy superficially. For us to know Heidegger, it seems necessary to self-identify with him, but there is a third and, in my eyes, decisive possibility. Along with the loving scholastic reading and the superficial critical reading, there's also the philosophical reading. Philosophical reading loves the philosopher. It knows eros, the erotic dimension of its respective philosophy. But beyond that, it knows the erotic dimension of philosophy par excellence. It knows the freedom of thought which inscribes itself in every philosophy. And the freedom of philosophy counts more than obedience to a beloved thinker. The Heideggerians are not familiar with this experience. That is their weakness. They are not philosophers and never can be. Heidegger's texts require, perhaps more than others, a philosophical interpretation. It could be that Heidegger knew that one only is a real reader if he enjoys the seductions and indulges in them without falling into ruin. From this standpoint, I reject the view that Heidegger's self-interpretations must be the beginning of every interpretation, just as much as I reject the temptation of bathing in Heidegger's thinking as in the endless melody of Wagnerian music drama. I turn now to the question of whether we can speak of a being historical anti-Semitism in Heidegger. For this, it must become clear what that could mean in the context of Heidegger's thinking in general. In other words, we must try to understand the being historical character of these claims about Judaism. For these two things must be accomplished. First, we must get to know the essential characteristics of Heidegger's thinking of the history of being in the 30s and the 40s. Secondly, we must question whether the remarks about World-Judaism are related to being historical thinking, and, what is more, we must find out whether these remarks first become comprehensible from the vantage point of being historical thinking. However, to make these two questions possible, we must take note of the most important aspects of Heidegger's remarks about Judaism and World-Judaism. Accordingly, I will begin my deliberations with this. I want to cite three of Heidegger's remarks, isolating the core statements in each. And I guess that at least the speakers, everyone has a handout where no, not everyone? No handouts?
Handouts are out.
Okay.
There weren't enough.
Okay. First, the reason for I'm citing now Heidegger. First, the reason for the temporary increase in power of Judaism, however, is that the metaphysics of the West, particularly in its modern development, provided the starting point for the spread of a rather empty rationality and calculative ability, which in these ways procured accommodation for itself in spirit without ever being able to grasp the concealed regions of decision on their own terms. And after this quotation, he goes on with criticizing Husserl as an example for this empty rationality. Secondly, second quotation. Even the thought of an agreement with England in the sense of a distribution of the franchise of imperialism does not get at the essence of the historical process which England plays out to the end from within Americanism and Bolshevism. And this means at the same time also from within World-Judaism. The question concerning the role of World-Judaism is not a racial one, but rather the metaphysical question concerning the kind of humanity which, utterly unattached, can take over the uprooting of all beings from being as its world historical task. And the third quotation, World-Judaism, spurred on by the immigrants led out of Germany, is everywhere elusive. In all the unfurling of its power, it need nowhere engage in military actions, whereas it remains for us to sacrifice the best blood of the best of our own people. Concerning the first argument, the first quotation, the remark can be reduced to three basic propositions. A, Judaism comes into view in the course of a temporary increase in power. B, this is related to contemporary metaphysics. And C, contemporary metaphysics is characterized by an empty rationality and calculative reckoning, which is why the increasing power of Judaism with their calculative capacity is related to this. Concerning A, it is one of Heidegger's essential propositions about modern history that in its course it has increasingly taken shape as a history of the will to power. The modern subject, the Cartesian ego cogito me cogitare, ultimately projects itself as complete only in view of its possible perspectives for willing and expanding its power. To do so, it subjugates itself in its inventions to a technology that in the 30s Heidegger, drawing upon Ernst Jünger's concept of total mobilization, or actually Mobilmachung, characterizes as machination. Machination in which all beings appear in the perspective of making, or we could say of production, was once described by Heidegger in the Black Notebooks as follows. The power of machination, the extermination even of the godlessness, the humanization of man into the animal, the exploitative utilization of the earth, the apportionment of the world, has entered a state of finality. Differences of people, states, cultures exist only as facades. Machination cannot be inhibited and disabled by any measures. God, humanity, earth, world, a prefiguration of the fourfold, are wholly occupied by the power of machination. All it is integrated into it, nothing can prevent this integration. In the last notes of the reflections from 1941, but not only there, the thought appears that a connection exists between the eruption of the World War and the power of machination. It is not accidental that a history ends in the gigantic confrontation of totalitarian technical systems of National Socialism, Bolshevism, Americanism, and also World-Judaism. The unfolding of the power of machination to its finality, however, leads to B, the historical time-space to modern metaphysics. This begins, as you know, in Descartes' thinking and ends, concludes in Nietzsche's thinking. This thought belongs to the narrative of being historical thinking. Being unconceals itself in modernity as the will of the subject, consequently, I-ness ramping itself up beyond the will to will of Hegel into the will to power of Nietzsche. The movement of history is ascending, Geschick, that is to say, it is not due to humanity's influence, but to an internal developmental dynamic of being in modernity and its understandings. The Zurich seminar of 1951 provides an example of this thinking. There Heidegger says that the atomic bomb exploded long ago, namely in the moment when man stepped into an uprising against being and positioned being in and of himself and made it the object of his representation. And he adds, this is since Descartes. The atomic bomb, exploded in the Meditations. And finally, regarding C, empty rationality and calculative capacity is typical of modern thought. With this, Heidegger means the occurrence that in modern science, mathematics is technically instrumentalized for the exploitative utilization of the earth, the apportionment of the world, as was said earlier. And Descartes actually characterizes humanity, the modern subject, as you know, as maître et possesseur de la nature. Much could be said about the differentiation of science and its history, and also about the problematic relationship that, since Hegel, philosophy has to this history. But it is more important to see that Heidegger inscribes Judaism in this history of modern technology and science, or as he terms it, of machination. He ascribes to Judaism a calculative capacity. At this point, we must be accurate because Heidegger was. In the contributions to philosophy, this very important text from the middle of the 30s, we find the following thought. It says, it is pure idiocy to say that experimental research is Nordic-Germanic and that, on the other hand, rational research is alien or foreign. We must then actually have to decide to count Newton and Leibniz among the Jews, in quotation marks. Heidegger was therefore not persuaded by the differentiation between a German or Aryan physics and a Jewish physics. He rejected it because he was aware that such a distinction is impossible in the project of modern science. But that does not mean that this thought from the contributions contradicts the imputation that the Jews are defined by a calculative capacity. There is a difference here between the propositions all calculative thinking is Jewish and all Jewish thinking is calculative. The first proposition is false because modern science was not established by the Jewish. The second proposition, Heidegger apparently considered accurate. All Jewish thinking is calculative. The consequence of all these considerations is that the ascription of calculative thinking to Judaism enabled Heidegger to depict Judaism as a moment of the will of machination. Judaism is a representative of modern technology next to other such representatives, including, incidentally, the National Socialists. If I can characterize this whole construct of historical classification of Judaism as being historical on the one hand, and likewise consider the attribution of a gift for calculation to Jews as an anti-Semitic stereotype on the other, then we are here dealing with a being historical anti-Semitism. Concerning 2, the second remark is divided into propositions that are fundamentally difficult to connect. A, there is a historical process in which England has played a role that cannot be changed by an agreement. And B, the role of World-Judaism, in which England has a role to play, and in addition to which, this is important, Americanism and Bolshevism likewise play their parts. This World-Judaism is not racially grounded, but stems from the metaphysical question concerning the kind of humanity that is utterly unattached, thus accepting as world historical task the uprooting of all beings from being. The first part of this thought need not, it seems, detain us long. Heidegger, similar to Nietzsche, not only despised English philosophy, but above all the English spirit, which for him is a merely economically oriented imperialist pragmatism. It would perhaps be possible to correlate Heidegger's thinking at the end of the 30s with Hitler's speeches. If we think of Hitler's speech on the 8th of November 1939, we find again this peculiar mix of contempt for England and anti-Semitic allusions. By the way, it appears to me that the person of Hitler represents the key, maybe to understanding the Heideggerian loyalty to the Third Reich. The second part of the thought is more important. Heidegger maintains, first of all, that an understanding of World-Judaism does not necessarily have to be racially motivated. I will leave this without comment for now. The question concerning racism in Heidegger must, in my opinion, be posed anew I have done this in my book, but now, on account of time constraints, I will leave the issue to one side. There is a kind of metaphysics of World Judaism. World Judaism represents a humanity that, being unattached or unbounded itself, furthers the uprooting of all beings from being. However, World Judaism plays an important role in the cited passage. I cite in part here once again. Even the thought of an understanding with England in the sense of a distribution of the franchise, that is to say the right or law of the established authority of imperialism, does not strike the essence of the historical process, namely that England now plays to the end within Americanism and Bolshevism, and that is to say at the same time within World Judaism. The question concerns the sequence, England, Americanism, Bolshevism, that is to say at the same time also World Judaism. What does that is to say mean here? Are England, Americanism, Bolshevism not only equal but the same as World Judaism? Perhaps World Judaism is even the ground or the origin of Bolshevism, Americanism, and England. A note from 1942, forthcoming in GA 97, reads, "In the time-space of the Christian West, and this means in the time-space of metaphysics, Jewry, die Judenschaft, Jewry is the principle of disintegration. That which is disintegrative in the reversal of the completion of metaphysics, i.e. the reversal of Hegel's metaphysics by Marx. Spirit and culture become the superstructure of life, i.e. of the economy, i.e. of organization, i.e. of the biological, i.e. of the people." Let me read this in German, maybe because it's strange. Die Judenschaft ist im Zeitraum des christlichen Abendlandes, das heißt der Metaphysik, das Prinzip der Zerstörung. Das Zerstörerische in der Umkehrung der Vollendung der Metaphysik, das heißt der Metaphysik Hegels durch Marx. Der Geist und die Kultur wird zum Überbau des Lebens, das heißt der Wirtschaft, das heißt der Organisation, das heißt des Biologischen, das heißt des Volkes. I refer only to the second half of the citation. Marx, the Jew, turns Hegel's metaphysics around. With that inversion, spirit is the epiphenomenon of economy and organization. Apart from the fact that Heidegger takes it as a disintegration, it can now become clear in how far Jewry, die Judenschaft, and World Judaism is the source of Bolshevism, Americanism, and England, even of the biological of National Socialism that Heidegger mentions. And by the way, this is exactly the phantasma in Hitler's Mein Kampf. Judaism is the source of everything what is not considered as German. World press, intellectual solitude, capitalism, communism, bellicistic politics, pacifistic dreaming, everything is Jewish. Therefore, it is said, Judaism is the principle of disintegration. In what way? The detachment of the Jewish is connected to the furthering of the uprooting of beings from being. The detachment of World Judaism is a kind of, as it was called elsewhere, worldlessness, or, in my interpretation, homelessness. This concerns the Jewish diaspora, the Galut, a disintegration that the Jewish people had to bear since the Babylonian conquest of the kingdom of Judea in 597 before Christ. In this sense, the diaspora is the condition of Zionism, and it is noteworthy that the Dreyfus affair in France at the end of the 19th century had both the protocols of the Elders of Zion as well as Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat in its wake. But this is only an aside. The unattachedness of World Judaism apparently allowed it to further advance the uprooting of all beings from being. To give a being historical interpretation of this idea, in my opinion, requires first briefly considering Heidegger's being historical understanding of homeland, Heimat, and homelessness, Heimatlosigkeit. In a comment from the beginning of the 1940s, we read the following remark about the home, about Heimat. Home is the appropriation of earth to become a site for the preparation of residence which safeguards the arrival of being from whose truth gods and humans first conceive the region of their response. Allow me to add to this a further definition of home from the same text. Home is the historical site of the truth of being called and received by the earth, rooted in it and in it held safe. This understanding of home is no longer related, by the way, to a concrete nationally bounded community, to a people in the everyday sense. Home is, at this point, thought from Ereignis as the event of appropriation, as the historical provenance of the truth of being. Earth belongs necessarily to this home. It calls and receives the historical side of the truth of being. The side is rooted and held safely in it. It concerns, in other words, what Heidegger elsewhere called the intimacy of the strife between world and earth. The home as world is rooted in and held safe by the earth. The world occasions the earth's opening and uncovering. Home, world, and earth open a respective history, however, when they happen as strife. Returning to unattached World-Judaism, this means that with the uprooting of beings from being, World-Judaism promotes homelessness in a being historical sense. World-Judaism, in its earthless diaspora, works towards the making impossible of a sense of home. How could they not, since they are excluded from the historical happening of the strife between world and earth? However, in order to further the uprooting of all beings from being, that is to say, the separation of beings from being, a certain capability is required. We are already acquainted with this. It is the calculative capacity that grasps technology and mathematics as a universal instrument to grind down every historically developed difference between cultures or peoples. And yet, this is apparently not the only way that World-Judaism brings about disintegration. Immediately after his depiction of the role that Marx plays in the history of metaphysics, Heidegger continues with the following thought, coming in GA 97. Only when what is essentially Jewish, in quotation marks, in the metaphysical sense, fights against the Jewish, without quotation marks, only then is the pinnacle of self-destruction attained in history. Assuming that the Jewish, with quotation marks, has everywhere completely seized control, such that even combat against the Jewish, with quotation marks, and this first and foremost will be brought under its sway. In German. Wenn erst das wesenhaft Jüdische in Anführungsstrichen im metaphysischen Sinne gegen das Jüdische ohne Anführungsstriche kämpft, ist der Höhepunkt der Selbstvernichtung in der Geschichte erreicht. Gesetzt, dass das Jüdische mit Anführungsstrichen überall die Herrschaft vollständig an sich gerissen hat, sodass auch die Bekämpfung des Jüdischen in Anführungsstrichen und sie zuvörderst in die Botmäßigkeit zu ihm gelangt. Heidegger completes a movement of thought he had already discovered earlier. It is not easy to grasp. National Socialism is an epiphenomenon of machination, and that now means of the Jewish with quotation marks. The Jewish with quotation marks, it actually means National Socialism. However, he now sees in a struggle with the Jewish without quotation marks, and that means with World-Judaism, not to say with the persecuted European Jews. Thus, the self-destruction of machination is a self-destruction of the Jewish, with quotation marks. To fight against this, against what is Jewish, with quotation marks, would be to be brought under its sway, i.e. would become itself a form of the Jewish, with quotation marks. I would like to pose here again the question of a being historical anti-Semitism and respond to questions concerning its legitimacy. For Heidegger, the peculiar worldlessness of the Jewish goes together with their calculative capacity. To the extent that this worldlessness is driving the uprooting of beings from being, it collides with the being historical home as the appropriation of earth for the site of the preparation of residence. I have here a digression. I will skip to Levinas' article, Heidegger, Gagarin, and Us, because I think that this interpretation of Levinas that he makes a contrast between Heidegger's thinking and the universality of Judaism is, in a certain way, the exact response to what Heidegger actually thought. So it's interesting to read Levinas' Heidegger, Gagarin, and us again in the horizon of these being historical anti-Semitism. But I will skip it because we don't have enough time, or I don't have enough time. I will come to my to the third and last quotation. Because the third of Heidegger's comments is no longer before us, I will read it again. World-Judaism, spurred on by the emigrants led out of Germany, is everywhere elusive. In all the unfurling of its power, it need nowhere engage in military actions, whereas it remains for us to sacrifice the best blood of the best of our own people. The proposition works with three subjects: A, World Judaism; B, emigrants who were allowed to leave Germany; C, we ourselves who sacrificed the best blood of the best of our own people. We have already heard now how World Judaism plays a role in the power of machination. The World War is the decisive context for this remark. Emigrants spur on World Judaism. It is not said who Heidegger is thinking of: Jewish refugees, people such as Thomas Mann, who broadcast his speeches with the help of the BBC in London. They, just like we, appear to be identifiable. It is stated of World Judaism that it is everywhere elusive. Überall unfassbar in German. The worldlessness of Judaism appears to mean that it is everywhere, but in this everywhere it conceals itself and remains ungraspable. The semantic of grasping, however, already indicates the problematic of this point. The everywhere ungraspable World Judaism is powerful precisely because it is everywhere ungraspable. And it is even on account of this special power that World Judaism needs to participate nowhere in acts of war. But how is that possible? At this point, I want to remind us to the already mentioned Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In his book, What is Anti-Semitism?, Wolfgang Benz, one of the most important historians of National Socialism in actual Germany, pointed out that the concept of World Judaism generally belongs in the context of a myth of a Jewish world conspiracy. In this sense, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion represent a textual incanubula, an absolute point of reference. It is the original document of modern anti-Semitism, even it is not the only source of it. The malicious fiction of the protocol describes a Judaism which strives for world domination and which recognizes even war as a possibility in this striving. Under the heading, The Taming of the Resistance of the Non-Jewish Through War and a General World War, it states that, I'm quoting the protocols, as soon as a non-Jewish state dares to resist us, we must be in a position to incite its neighbors to war against it. But if the neighbors too want to make common cause with it and advance against us, we must unleash a world war. There's no way of proving whether Heidegger had actually read the protocols. There is a remark by Karl Jaspers according to which Heidegger was aware of them. According to this remark, in a discussion concerning the evil nonsense of the Elders of Zion, Heidegger had once maintained, but there is an international association of Jews. Heidegger would not have needed to read the fiction of the protocols in order to be taken in by them. They were an element of National Socialist propaganda. Hannah Arendt had noted this connection with a book by Alexander Stein written in 1936 entitled Adolf Hitler, Schüler der Weisen von Zion, Adolf Hitler, student of the Elders of Zion. In any case, we hear a reference to such anti-Semitism in Hitler's speech on the 30th of January 1939, which states, very famous quotation here, if international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the peoples once more into a world war, then the consequence will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and therewith the victory of Judaism, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. One can consider this speech as the first announcement of the annihilative actions of task forces of the state police and the SD Sicherheitsdienst, which began with the invasion of Poland in September 1939. Heidegger followed Hitler's speeches and would have taken note of this remark about the international Jewish financiers. Their spirit, or rather their spectre, speaks from the protocols of the elders of Zion. This elucidates the context in and out of which Heidegger's remark about World-Judaism's being everywhere ungraspable is uttered. World-Judaism has become an international agitating power that can make use of certain figures, England, the USA, the Soviet Union, without having to come into view itself. At the same time, Heidegger obviously regards it as an enemy of the German people. Otherwise, we could not explain the contrast he proposes. Whereas, for us, it only remains to sacrifice the best blood of the best of our own people. Coming to the end. Ernest Renan wrote in 1883, the Judaism which so far has been good for the past will be good for the future. It is the true root of liberalism. It answers to the modern spirit, esprit moderne. Every Jew is a liberal. He is so by his essence. The enemies of Judaism, however, if you only look at them more closely, you will see that they are the enemies of the modern spirit in general. Renan's own position to Judaism is not important here. It is vital that he ascribes to Judaism a representation of the modern spirit, i.e. to be of the modern age. In this way, the anti-Semite is an anti-modernist. If Heidegger uses the concept of modernity at all, he uses it in quotation marks. While his use of quotation marks is a topic of all its own, with regards to modernity, they are meant critically. Is there a fourth era besides antiquity and the Middle Ages after modernity that we could determine positively? Doubtful, according to Heidegger. The determination of the concept modern remains problematic. It is ambiguous and therefore mostly misunderstood. The argument is, even to this day, to what extent the Enlightenment of the 18th century is at the center of this concept. Is modernity a child of Kant's critique? And if so, to what extent? Is modern rationality the epitome of the media publicity? However, such questions might shift the meaning of the concept of modernity. Its use in many contexts is still unavoidable. Here, for my reading of Heidegger's remarks on World-Judaism, it is not necessary to present a complete concept of modernity. It is enough to single out from these remarks, without attempting to be comprehensive, both negative and positive moments that cluster around the concept of modernity. These meanings include, first, homelessness, i.e. the mobility of Judaism. Secondly, originlessness, Ursprungslosigkeit in relation to the first beginning, i.e. the complete inclusion of Judaism in the calculative thinking of modernity. And third, devastation, i.e. the complete inclusion of Judaism in machination. All three meanings from a coherent semantic field that also revolve around each other. Accordingly, Judaism would be the source of homelessness and originlessness, and respectively the devastation of an idealistic ordering of metaphysics. This semantic field belongs to the epochal sense of modernity. The modern subject emancipates itself from national or ethnic determination so as to be able to follow the advances of universal capital unhindered. In so doing, it assumes that ideological, political, religious, aesthetic, or moral determinations recede before the technical, pragmatic demands of a universal way of life. If possible, has Heidegger here confused the modern subject with the Jew? Does the meaning of being historical anti-Semitism perhaps lie in a hidden being historical survey of the modern spirit? No. A shift from being historical anti-Semitism to a being historical anti-modernism is not permissible. In fact, the identification of Judaism with the modern spirit itself remains caught up in a stereotype which today we would interpret as anti-Semitic, a stereotype, incidentally, that is countered, by the way, by Zionism. However, even if we do not permit the shift from being historical anti-Semitism to a being historical anti-modernism, there remains nevertheless a consistent interpretation that being historical anti-Semitism has traits of a being historical anti-modernism. The impact of this connection is troubling. It seems to be a thorn in the side of Heidegger's thinking. For let us assume that today freedom consists in a minimum personal distance from the undeniable present-at-hand universal reduction of modernity, then we would have to acknowledge that this freedom is not only no longer to be thought with Heidegger, but also against him as well. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. So the first part of my question is clarificatory, so if I misheard you, please let me know. I thought I heard you distinguish between three possibilities for reading Heidegger. We could read Heidegger as Heideggerians, as sort of in the spirit of a neutered kind of scholarship, or we could give a philosophical reading of Heidegger. And I was wondering whether you thought or are open to the idea that Heidegger himself might have opened a possibility for reading Heidegger philosophically, in your sense of the philosophical reading. I have, and if so, whether that is relevant to you, given what you said about being skeptical about accepting Heidegger's self-interpretation as a starting point for reading him. I have two passages in mind specifically. First, in On Time and Being, Heidegger says, the point is not to follow the propositions as if they're just resulting in a conclusion to an argument, but rather to follow the movement of showing. This is giving us a certain gesture to how to read. And then he also talks about how there are two possibilities in what is called thinking. We can either go counter to a thinker or go to a thinker's encounter. And the way that I read this, just in general, is it sounded a little similar to what you were saying about philosophical reading, and I was wondering if that was relevant to you in any way.
Yeah, that's the thing. I guess that at first I hope that this is Heidegger's intention, that he does not that he did not want to produce Heideggerians, and that he in a certain way created some obstacles to become a philosophical reader of himself. But of course, in a certain way, you cannot be very sure if you see this being historical treatises of the 30s in this, in my view, esoteric style. But nevertheless, you're totally right that this phenomenological approach to the thing itself and to the problem itself is I guess what we can take from Heidegger's philosophy in the best case. So I guess to deal philosophically with a philosopher is necessary. Yeah.
Thank you. Just wondered, based on your definition, if Judaism is equal to modernization, liberal, American, all the good stuff that you associated with Judaism, quote unquote, is that right to assume that Europe is anti all of those things that belongs to Judaism? In other words, if they're the anti-Semitism, meaning they're anti-liberalism, modernization, Americanism, whatever it is that you associated with that name, is that right to assume they want to stop all of that?
Not me.
Not you, but
no.
I'm talking about the anti-Semitism strategy.
Yeah, well, I guess that is a topic in. It's not. I have to say that it's not a bright idea by myself, but that there is a possibility to identify anti-Semitism with anti-modernism. That's an old topic in this discussion, and I guess that you can find moments of this in Heidegger's thinking of anti-Semitism, and that's what I wanted actually to propose. And of course, for Heidegger, of course, it was something what was not. Like I tried to show, it was not something what he would have confirmed, of course. So he in this way he is probably, at least in the Black Notebooks, maybe the last anti-modernist or the last knight fighting against modernity. In a certain way, der Aufhalter. I don't know how we can translate. I don't know in the English word. Yeah, in this sense, it's true that anti-modernism and anti-Semitism can be identified. Yeah. Yeah.
So in that sense, the today's Islamic extremists, they have the same goal. So is that why Europe is almost kind of like the idea of this Islamic revolution?
No, we are not fans of the ISIS. I don't think so. Well, but of course, I guess that this, for instance, linked with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, in the Islamic world, these ideas are still vital. You are right. I guess I'm not a specialist in these things, but I guess that the if you look in the internet, the popularity of the protocols is still astonishing, and most of all, or there are a lot of Arabic websites concerning this. Yeah.
So my question, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, hi, so thank you very much. My question is about maybe a sensitivity to the word Judaism or Jewishness or being historical Jewish. Because it seems as though what you're highlighting is that Heidegger's critique is against calculative thinking, and that even in your talk that you make a claim something like that Judaism or modern technology are equivalent in some sense in this writing, but that also then Judaism is then the source of national socialism. This is a very similar argument that, say, Zizek makes in The Sublime Object of Ideology. So the relationship between Judaism as being the source of national socialism is, I don't think, necessarily just saying claiming some kind of responsibility of the victim in the language of Heidegger, but I wonder if there is a kind of sensitivity that you're calling for when you say that this kind of equation of Judaism to modernism, to machination, to calculative thinking is, I think in the end you claim that is itself, that equation is anti-Semitic. So I wonder if there needs to be, if you're calling for a particular kind of almost a sensitivity to the use of the term Judaism as opposed to, let's say, the use of the term Americanism or the use of the term Bolshevikism or the use of the term calculation. Is there something specific about Judaism in which it's deployed that calls for us, given the Holocaust, a kind of sensitivity? Or does actually the call for that kind of sensitivity, what I'm worried about is that tends to replicate the very biological thinking that Heidegger is criticizing by saying that using the term Jewishness in this way relates to a very concrete racialized referent.
What I think is quite clear if you read Heidegger that he we don't have documents that you can think that Heidegger is interested in Judaism. he is not actually. I guess it's the same problem. It belongs to this. Maybe it belongs to this contrast. To this contradiction he opens up between Christianity and Greek philosophy. The first beginning for him, Judaism is finally a part of Christianity, and Christianity is attacked in the Black Notebooks very, very, very strongly. So this decision he made that we are actually that we have to refer to the Greek beginning. This decision is so strong that he never read, I guess, whatever Judaistic literature, and so in this respect, you are right that there is no sensibility for the term, for the phenomenon in Heidegger. It's it's the same thing with Americanism, Bolshevism. He uses these blocks like we know what it is actually. So this is quite clear that he is not able to a differentiated perspective of what happens there. So you're right that this lack of sensibility is well, one of the first impressions when you read the Black Notebooks.
While you are right about Heidegger's strong anti-Christianity in the notebooks, the question arises as to your use of the term esoteric versus exoteric. How does Heidegger's use of those, your imputation to Heidegger of the term esoteric, how does that compare with Leo Strauss's use of esoteric and exoteric?
Yeah, I wouldn't. No, there is no. I don't think that there is a possible reference between what Leo Strauss calls esoteric writing and what Heidegger did. It's a different differentiation in Heidegger. When Strauss thought of styles of writing in the 18th century or in the 19th century or in the 17th century, where the philosopher has a certain esoteric message in an esoteric style for certain readers, and in this sense for rational readers, for the authentic readers of what he meant to say in his in the texts. In Heidegger, it's different. It's maybe if you have an example in German history of literature, for instance, you could think of Stefan George as a poet with his certain circle, where he has a certain tone to speak to a certain addressee in a certain style, and this is not the esoteric writing of Leo Strauss. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University. Please visit us at emory.edu.